So we'll start, just in case there's local people in the audience, I'll say a few words in Catalan if you don't mind. Benvinguts a les persones que no heu estat a la conferència acadèmica, benvinguts a la sessió oberta que hem organitzat. Volíem que muntar una sessió acadèmica a Barcelona, en anglès, amb persones internacionals, no fos només una cosa per gent de fora o per la gent que hi entén, sinó que volíem tenir un espai de trobada també amb un altre tipus de públic i per tant hem muntat aquesta sessió oberta. Com que la conferència és en anglès i els ponents són en anglès, per això tot serà en anglès i esperem que pugueu seguir, si no li podeu demanar a la persona del costat que us ajudi. Gràcies però per venir, esperem que la sessió d'avui us sigui profitosa. So if you've gone to any other SSN conference, you might have noticed that this one is a bit bigger than the others. There might be lots of reasons for that. I guess we cannot take credit for the sun. But it's quite clear also that Snowden and the NSA revelations have had a huge impact in our field. The awareness of the issues that we've been discussing for many years, some even decades, are now on the table way more than ever before, and probably there's a lot more academic interest in the issues that we work with. In a way, the outbreak of these Snowden revelations was the end of innocence for many, not just people, but also governments, just realizing how surveillance works and to what extent it can work. And I think that thanks to those revelations, we are more aware of how our data is being used and sometimes, even often, abused by those governments or corporations or even other people. In this conference, we've also seen the extent of our field. We've had sessions on big data and social media, but also on the history of surveillance, on fiction, on anti-terrorist policy. So I think that some of us have seen the surveillance field explode before our eyes in the last few years. The 9/11 was a major stepping stone in that progress, and the NSA revelations are also a stepping stone in the other direction in a way. So we've come full circle, I hope. However, there's an underlying paradox in what we've been seeing happening in the world in the last 10 or so years, is that there's this data-based securitization process, but the more we worry about security, the more insecure we feel, and that's what all the surveys show. But also, the more vulnerable our data is, but also the data of everyone else, all those who are not supposed to be put under the spotlight, all those who should have the presumption of innocence, and nonetheless, they're still under the electronic eye. So everyone else who are also in this massive surveillance, there's always, again, this everyone else, basically, the blanket surveillance of everybody, just for the sake of security. We've seen these increasing numbers of everyone else's, which is us, the false positives, those affected by the blank collection of data. So in this scenario, we wanted to have this panel, firstly as a tribute to Snowden and whistleblowing in general, and doing things for the common good, but also to contribute to understand what are the new challenges in this new scenario for those trying to challenge the surveillance society and those trying to promote privacy as the civil rights of the 21st century. It's been mentioned before, but the NSA revelations show that the social contract underpinning the exchange of data between people and their governments and corporations has been broken. There's no trust anymore, because there cannot be trust, because there's proof that the trust that could have existed, may have existed, has been broken. So this social contract needs to be rebuilt, and that will not be done disregarding people's fundamental rights or not understanding the potential but also the dangers of new surveillance technologies. So these are all the things that we've been trying to explore in this conference, and these are some of the things that we're going to be addressing in this evening's session. So without much further ado, I'll just present the three speakers we have today. We've got hold on, let me put you on the big screen. Now, I don't know how to do that, yeah. We've got Ben Wizner, the director, hold of the ACLU Speech Privacy and Technology Project, also known as Snowden's lawyer, who's joining us from the US. Hi, Ben. We've got Caspar Bowden, an independent privacy researcher based in southern France. How nice. And the ex-chief privacy officer at Microsoft. And we've got Katarzyna Szymielewicz from the Panopticon Foundation in Poland. The initial idea was to have Ben speaking first, but I'm guessing we're going to have to solve those problems. And if Caspar doesn't mind, we'll give you the floor immediately. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Caspar.
The reason that I'm here is because I left Microsoft in 2011, and my job for the previous 2 or 3 years had been trying to figure out how to persuade governments that the cloud was safe. And so I did my homework, and I read the American laws, and what I found was very, very disturbing, because when I put together what I discovered in the American laws with what I knew from European data protection, it wasn't just the case that these American laws existed and nobody was paying attention to them. There was clearly what I could only call a deep degree of complicity within European institutions, in the sense that there were exemptions provided in the existing European data protection laws, and also a new batch of loopholes, I'd have to call them, which had been cooked up really in cahoots between some of the major cloud computing companies and European data protection authorities. So I tried to tell civil society about this, and I tried to tell the European Commission, and I tried to tell some data commissioners who, from my time on the privacy circuit, I knew quite well. And nobody wanted to do anything about it. Nobody said my analysis was wrong. Nobody said this isn't really something that we ought to be dealing with. But more or less, those 3 sectors said, look, it's not my job to boil this ocean. I've got my little projects mapped out, my little plans. I fit in here. If what you say is true, Caspar, this is so unthinkable. I really don't know what to do about it. So I had a stroke of luck. I met some academics who were just starting a project writing a report for the European Parliament on cybercrime and cloud computing. And they invested great faith in me, and I'm very grateful to Professor Didier Bigot, especially, for inviting me into that project, because he allowed me to write a central section of that report, which was published in October 2012, which essentially laid out what we now know as PRISM, in some detail. And I did a panel with Peter Swire, who's one of the authors of the official Obama NSA report back in Brussels in January, and Peter Swire was nice enough to acknowledge that what I wrote 9 months before Snowden was 100% accurate. So after that report came out, I then tried to get some interest in the media, and I offered exclusive pieces to The Guardian, to the BBC, to The Guardian. They wouldn't touch it. I did, by some sort of cunning media manipulation, manage to get a little bit of coverage in the German press, the French press, and then I did a presentation of the report to European Parliament in February. This is now 4 months before Snowden, and laid out the thing fairly clearly. And as a result of that, I was invited to draft some amendments very rapidly for the amendments to the new General Data Protection Regulation, which were closing. But it's clear that sort of people couldn't really believe what I was saying. And, you know, I can't really fault them for that, given the enormity of what we subsequently discovered. But then what happened is, of course, Snowden, and within 1 day, it was confirmed that PRISM was all based on the 702 law, which I've been analyzing. And then the European Parliament phoned me up and said, Caspar, it's all true. Would you please write the official briefing note for the NSA aspect of the European Parliament's inquiry? And I'm very proud of that work. It's 35 pages. It's the best thing I've ever written. So do take a look at it if you can. I think it's still got some relevant points about strategy and insights into this dimension of European complicity. But if we could just briefly go to the slides that I prepared, only 5, I promise. But I just want to make some basic points about American law. Yeah. Yes, please. Now, can I just ask how many lawyers in the room? Oh, quite a few.
Ben.
And how how religiously would you say you've all followed the Washington Post, the Spiegel, the blow-by-blow of Snowden that we've seen in the last few months? Totally religiously, hands up? Okay, semi-thoroughly, and like skimmed it when you see it? Okay, well, this is the Surveillance Studies Conference after all. By the way, it's very nice to be back, and I should have said I'm enormously grateful for Gemma to be inviting me. So, is there one slide before?
Might be.
Okay. So, the central point that I've been banging on about now for nearly 3 years is that the structure of US law is very exceptionally exceptionalist. It's not really like any other structure of law in this respect that you'll find anywhere else that I know of. This crucial definition that first, as it were, put me on the trail actually goes back to 1978, to the first FISA Act passed under Jimmy Carter. And when you parse through 3 levels of legal definition, then the crucial term, foreign intelligence information, it can reduce to this. It can reduce simply to information with respect to a foreign-based political organization. It doesn't have to be a political party, it can be an NGO, can be a data protection authority, for example, or foreign territory that relates to the conduct of the foreign affairs of the US. So that's obviously incredibly broad. It's essentially limitless. And one extremely significant factor, now becoming more and more significant, is where that word relates is, well, that's the definition that applies if you're not a US person. If you were a US person, that word relates would be necessary. In other words, the very definition of the surveillance activity in question is conditional on the passport that you carry. No other system of law really does that in that way that I'm aware of. So if we go to the next slide, we know that President Obama made a speech in January, and alongside that speech, he published Presidential Policy Directive 28. And this is primarily about a different, not branch of law, but branch of US policy called Executive Order 12333. And this is the order which governs what the NSA does outside the US, in the rest of the world. The law that I've been analyzing, the FISA 702 law, is primarily about what can happen to your data if you send it to an American company. And therefore it falls within US jurisdiction. Executive Order 1233 is really about what the NSA does completely in other parts of the world, which can include tapping fiber optic cables or bugging people's phones and breaking in through the various means that Snowden's revealed. So in Obama's speech, there were some warm words about trying to get more equal treatment of rights, but what I want to very briefly demonstrate is that's a crock, and this is why. Firstly, in the very definition of foreign intelligence, which confusingly is a different definition from the one in the FISA law, but this is the definition that's applicable to stuff happening that the NSA does completely outside the US. In the very definition of foreign intelligence here, you still have this reference to foreign persons. So categorically by nationality, the nature of the surveillance activity is tied to nationality. And then if we go through that presidential directive, Section 1 is all about new limitations on the collection of data. And it says the US shall not collect signals intelligence for the purposes of suppressing or burdening criticism or dissent, or for disadvantaging persons based on their ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, or religion, which is nice. But does anyone seriously suppose that any existing NSA authorization for data collection is actually relying on any of those grounds already? I don't think so. So in practice, nothing's going to change regarding the collection of data. So if we go on to then the next section, limitations on use, there has been some genuine progress here, in one sense. What there is now in the directive is an exhaustive list of lawful purposes. So, for example, that very broad definition I showed earlier about relating to a foreign territory. That's not in this list. And that sounds great, but there are two snags. The first snag is that, well, there are three snags. The first snag is that these are the definitions governing Executive Order 12333. We haven't seen any similar constraint as a technicality appear over the parts I highlighted in FISA Section 702, the stuff that deals with cloud computing and American companies and what happens when you send your data there. The second snag is a sort of constitutional snag, which is a US president can essentially countermand this directive in secret and issue a new one. Effectively, a US president could at any time sort of hold their fingers behind their back and break a promise effectively made to the rest of the world through such a directive. And the third snag is this. So when you get to footnote 9 in these limitations on use, you find this directive is not intended to alter the rules applicable to US persons in Executive Order 12333 or the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act or other future or indeed existing applicable law. So in other words, this is window dressing. Effectively, in footnote 9, PPD 28 says the entire existing regime of discrimination by nationality is going to continue indefinitely into the future. So there will be new rules drafted by the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence that will treat US and non-US persons equally, but only regarding the dissemination and retention of information. In terms of the way that you can be targeted merely because you're not a US person, or at least meeting a lower legal standard, a much lower legal standard than if you were a US person, or in terms of how much information is collected and the way in which it's collected, a two-tier system is going to continue, as things stand. So this is why, to say the least, the European Commission has been sending sort of mixed messages, warming to the fact that there's any movement at all, but fundamentally there's a deception here, and a deception which in fact has been going on for quite a long time in this area of policy. So I'll just mention a few other themes which we can perhaps pick up. One sort of, or two technical observations might be useful. There's a great deal of hype, as everybody knows, about so-called cloud computing. What is cloud computing? Well, the real significance of cloud computing is not just some place to store your data. The real significance of cloud computing is when you have a warehouse packed full of computer servers, all quite close to each other, you can process data in parallel very efficiently. You can have algorithms which actually crunch on data, one processor, another processor, on different parts of the problem. But you can only do this efficiently, particularly for scientific and data searching type problems, if the computers are relatively close together. So that sort of processing doesn't really work if you do it very, very distributed, peer-to-peer. You have to sort of crunch on data with that intensity in a data center using the CPUs. Not just storing the data, but actually calculating on it. And so the brute fact is that you cannot compute on data unless it's decrypted. So Microsoft or Google or whoever the cloud provider is, they have to know your decryption key. Because even if the data is encrypted on the disk, it's got to be decrypted to be fed to the CPU. And it's at that point that the data becomes vulnerable to laws like FISA. And there's really nothing you can do about that. It's simply the fact that if you have a country that is prepared to use lawful means to require, coerce cloud companies to do that decryption and to hand over the data, there's nothing those companies can do. There's no way that we can know about that if that happens, because of course all these laws are secret. The second sort of technical point I'd like to make is that really it doesn't matter whether you're talking about free software systems or Microsoft. Operating systems these days are so big and built with such lack of rigor that there is effectively an infinite supply of security critical bugs which exist, so-called 0 days warning that you have before somebody discovers and exploits them. So it doesn't really matter, in fact in some ways it's rather stupid to incentivize bug hunting, because all you're doing is actually creating the market conditions to incentivize people discovering bugs, all of which could be security lethal, And that's not really the sort of thing you want to encourage, because you're never going to be able to squash them all. There's just too many out there in the extant code bases. And frankly, nobody has any idea how we're going to move to any kind of software architecture that will get rid of that. But you shouldn't draw from that the implication that somehow trying to resist spying, particularly spying from foreign intelligence agencies, is somehow hopeless. There's an enormous practical difference in security terms between, shall we say, handing the data over on a plate in bulk to essentially some other country's jurisdiction, and then trying to defend yourself if some other country's intelligence agency is trying to break into your computers. They may still well be able to, but they're essentially pinpoint attacks, and you can try and detect them, and you can try and stop them, and you can try and do some other sneaky stuff to make sure they don't work very well. So they are categorically different risk situations, and what we have seen on the back of Snowden is what I believe is a false agenda of, oh my God, let's beware of balkanization. Let's not balkanize the internet. In my view, this is completely intellectually misplaced, because it is confusing two entirely different technical situations, that of censorship, essentially trying to stop information getting in someplace, with confidentiality, that is trying to make sure that your confidential data does not go out where it should. And you can just see it's common sense. If you want to protect data from the sort of risks that we now are all aware of, you keep it close at hand. You don't put it on more machines than you have to, you don't transfer it to more legal parties than you have to, and you certainly don't transfer it to another jurisdiction if you have reason to believe that that jurisdiction is exploiting that data in an untrammeled way. What I'll come back to just a little bit later in the conversation, I think, is this does open up, I think, enormously exciting new research vistas for the surveillance studies community. I think, understandably, in the past, there's been a natural focus on overt surveillance systems, systems which, because everybody knows about them, they affect society in a very obvious way. And, of course, to try and work, and some people have, some distinguished people in this community have tried to work in the area of covert mass surveillance. It's extremely hard to do research and to be sure of your sources. Well, now there's an awful lot to study, and I think some of the most interesting things to study will actually be what happened before Snowden, the nature of the complicity that I talked about. Why was civil society in Europe so quiescent, and still is relatively quiescent, and apparently uninterested in a fairly clear case that was made to them over the previous 2 years? Thank you very much.
Thank you.